Uh, so thank you all for being here for this for this briefing call that we're doing on what we expect in tech policy in 2023. I know this is something you would have expected the beginning of the year, but we were a bit caught up with the event on gaming regulations. It's still not done. We might do another one if we can, because I think the gaming companies, other than the real money gaming companies, haven't really been involved much until maybe a few days ago. But more on that later. Um, this, those of you who aren't aware of me, I've barely written this last year, but I've now started writing every couple of days. So I'm just writing a quick editorial. I hope you find it useful. I've been covering the internet domain in India for about 17 years, and there were 35 million internet users to now. Um, I, I look at things from a journalism perspective, from an investment perspective, as an entrepreneur. So I wear multiple hats and come at things with multiple perspectives, which I hope to bring to the table. But fundamentally, I look at things from a user standpoint, because at the end of the day, I am a citizen, I am a consumer, and that's what impacts me most. Um, so MediaNama has been around for about 14 years. We'll turn 15 in June. Big landmark year for us, this. And thank you all for subscribing to us to help us keep going. We need more subscribers. So if you know anyone else, please do reach out to them. Share our work with them. Might be useful for someone else. And let's see where this goes. So we focus largely on privacy data governance. We've been doing that for the last month, especially after the data protection bill, the latest version, or the non-data protection bill came out. But we covered a lot of platform regulation, antitrust, e-commerce. We've been covering fintech since like 2006. We're focusing a little bit on digitization of health, but surveillance, censorship are key areas for us. We do roundtables, we do open house discussions. I love going back to physical discussions. We've done 3 in the last month and a half, and the gaming one, if you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube, was intense. Like, I haven't seen that kind of energy at a discussion for a long time. It got a little heated at times, but it was a lot of fun, and wish some of you had been there, and hopefully you can join for our future discussions. Just on what's happening in India, this is October data from the TRAI. India's got 821.49 million broadband internet connections, mostly Geo. But what's important is that as per the last available data from the TRAI, I think September data, or maybe June data it is, there are Indians are consuming about 15.8 GB per connection per month. And that's largely down to very, very low internet access rates. The BBC a couple of days ago did a story, I was quoted in that, about why the mobile subscriptions are increasing. And as you can probably see, it's not because of data cost anymore. It's probably due to an economic downturn that's affected rural areas the most. It is probably due to insufficient access of language services in the country. And these are some of the problems which India will have to address as we go along, in order to increase internet penetration from some 67% to 90%, which is what China is at. Most of our connections are on mobile. Most of wireless is actually 4G. Very little narrowband connections left, even across all internet. There are about 31 million wireline connections, and at some level that also has to grow in order to improve high bandwidth access as well, right? But about 40% of the connections are rural, and just like most people use mobile devices for the internet. In terms of internet penetration, some cities and urban areas have got more than 100% internet broadband connectivity, which is that there are more people than there are more connections than people, and so there is a saturation of internet connectivity in urban areas, but in rural parts of the country there is room for growth, and at the same time, if you just look at the sheer numbers, it's a substantially large base, but growth is and has to come from rural India in India, right? So the next few years of tech policy making are going to be focused on bringing more and more people online, or as we've seen in the past, forcing more and more people to come online, because some services may not necessarily be available on the internet, will not be available without the internet, or will be difficult and cumbersome without the internet. Um, I think because of the rural penetration of the internet, especially with elections coming up, we need to remember that tech is political. And politics is going to impact how the internet gets regulated going forward, especially, like I said, in an election year. We saw this previously as well, but with regulatory changes taking place, more power being given to the government and government committees, you are going to see more enforcement of political leanings through regulation on the internet. There's been some controversies about a BBC documentary being removed from YouTube recently, but there's been content that's been removed from YouTube on a regular basis by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. And a lot of this is down to politics. So we are probably going to see more of that, but I'll get into more into the impact of elections on the internet in the next year a little later. Um, uh, just in terms of how the ecosystem is doing, what we're seeing is that, uh, last year was a landmark year for fundraising in India. It's now this year's it should be 2022, not 2023. There has been a reduction in fundraising, but that's also aligned with the global downturn that's taking place. Um, the other thing is that if you look at just in sectors that have been funded, a large part of down to e-commerce, which are largely very large deals. But there's also SaaS, which is enterprise tech, which has raised money. Last year, like the year before, was a year of fintech. A lot of fintech companies got funded. We haven't yet seen consumer services boom as much as they can. So I think we're going to see a bit of a shift in focus um, away from fintech over the next couple of years and into affiliated sectors. Uh, E-commerce has been largely on the decline when it comes to funding as well. Is something to keep in mind. Um, the number of deals are almost the same, which means that there is more funding happening at an early stage level. Again, sorry about it's 2022 and not 2023. So the amount of funding that's happening is mostly early stage deals. So there are startups that are getting funded, and late stage deals have largely stopped because of bad IPOs. So you're going to see now another new cycle beginning where more early stage funding will happen in India. India is still a growth market as far as global investors are concerned. And despite a liquidity crunch in the US, you're going to see more funding eventually come to India because it's a high growth market and it's accessible, whereas China isn't. So again, deal making largely has been focused on small e-commerce companies, and there were more that got funded last year. Some of this also includes D2C, and last year and the year before were largely focused on D2C brands, which is direct to consumer internet only products. But that's also now getting a little tricky, and there are more acquisitions taking in that place where distressed companies are being bought by larger brands. And we'll probably see more of that going forward. Um, in terms of how states have responded, because there is a lot of money, right? And essentially, this is what goes in. Uh, when there's funding, there's hiring, so it leads to employment, it leads to taxation, and so there are states that are launching startup focus policy. They've been doing so for the last few years. Some of them have changed their policies in the last year. But you're going to see more and more states trying to position themselves as more attractive destinations for startups. Delhi, Karnataka, uh, and to some extent Mumbai is where the funding is largely going. And other states like Telangana are trying very, very hard to draw draw people away. Chennai, of course, is the SaaS capital of India. A lot of SaaS companies um, built out of Chennai. That's the home of Zoho. Um, Tamil Nadu is the home of Zoho. So you're seeing and Zoho and Freshdesk, almost sister concerns, because Girish, who was with Zoho, left to start Freshdesk, and that's listed on Nasdaq now. So so you're going to see more policies, I think, and more creating an environment for startups to remain or invest, because otherwise Bangalore's drawing people away. In fact, a few friends of mine in Bombay have started this organization called Team, trying to make sure that Mumbai remains a destination for startups to start from, instead of people leaving for Bangalore. Um, Again, you're from how important is tech to India? In his August 15th speech, the Prime Minister talked about how tech is building a foundation for a self-reliant India. There is obviously a push to bring in electronic goods manufacturing, um, and a focus on rural India becoming digital. There is the rollout of India Stack and its affiliated stacks through healthcare infrastructure, um, uh, through education infrastructure, through um, credit and insurance mechanisms that are largely data driven. All of those systems are being rolled out in order to try and digitize parts of India. And sort of digitization is the core for digital transformation, is the way, and also transformation of India is the way the Prime Minister is seeing things. And this is something I heard him say even before he became the Prime Minister at an e-governance summit in Gujarat. I think in Ahmedabad, I was there in 2012, where he spoke. That story is also up on MediaNama, by the way. I was on a panel at the same conference. But broadly, the impact of tech on the fiscal nature of the country can't be ignored. But there is another side to things. I was at an Asia Society conference at the launch of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and I took down these notes from what our Minister of External Affairs, Jaishankar, said. And there is a sense of protectionism in how the government is looking at policies. So he said that there would be no free run in our market. That would be unilateral economic disarmament. No level playing field for foreign players in India is basically a direction that the government is looking at. So saying that it's an open market, it's economic suicide. So tech is also effectively geopolitical. There is a sense of looking at how China did things, and the minister spoke about incentives, the push for exports, globalizing an Indian 5G solution, and essentially digitize India and use the customer base that India has for businesses to build various industries. I remember him saying also that India is going to take a pragmatic approach and not a hard approach. It's going to look at pushing where it can and look at easing up things where it can. So, for example, there's easing up of the creation of incentives for manufacturing in the country, and that is linked largely to bypassing, allowing companies to set up operations here, because that's something that China also did. And what India is doing is leveraging the international situation um, uh, to try and bring more funds into India, to try and bring more investment, to bring more companies into the country, to try and create more wealth for people so that they reinvest in the country. So that's becoming, that's broadly the way, from a geopolitical perspective, India is thinking about things. But very clearly, as we are seeing across policies, India has got China envy. And there is, you hear the phrase, you hear mentions of China quite often when it comes to speech regulation, when it comes to commerce regulation, how China is controlling the market. And as you know, over the last couple of years, China's clamped down on its tech businesses fairly extensively. Um, and I wouldn't be surprised if, let's say, 7, 8, 10 years down the line, when there's growth, or maybe sooner, that isn't something that happens in India as well. So the roadmap is fairly clear that when you need growth, you go ahead, but there's also control that is being exercised um, over how things work in the space. Just a framework for thinking that I talk about quite often is that when you look at policies, right, think about the framework about data being the new oil. And so, the exertion of sovereign right over data, over essentially people's data in the country, no matter where it's stored in the world, or if we don't have control outside, bring it in. That's what's driving a large part of what we're seeing from a regulatory perspective. And again, the focus is really on making sure that there's um, control, making sure that over the data, and even if there's a little less investment because of that, uh, the government's clearly got a longer term focus. They're being pragmatic, but the broader direction is to sort of uh, build a little bit of a wall and exert a little more control, like it's there in case of China. Um, so if you thought data was a new oil, you would generate more data, you would control more data, and you would protect it. And we're seeing that in how policies are playing out, right? So there is a move to digitize everything. There is a view that government is a service provider, and it's basically running like a platform. So you need data, you need authentication, verification, and citizens are customers. So there are mechanisms that are being rolled out, like DEPA for as a consent architecture for sharing of data. That are account aggregators that will pull in data and share it forward once they have the consent. Um, there's a DigiLocker for storage of data, and then of course there's usage of data for artificial intelligence, which is a sort of a movement that India doesn't want to lose out on. Um, and quite often, when you look at it, there's a focus on against privacy because that hinders the spread of data. If you haven't read Smriti Pashira's book on privacy in healthcare, um, Ra- Rahul Mathan writes about AI in that perhaps that there should be no consent for purposes related to AI because that will hinder the development of AI in the country. And that's not a view that I agree with, but it sort of is in line with how there is thinking related there is in thinking in government policy. You're seeing that in the data protection bill with the approach towards deemed consent. In so I think this privacy is going to be under challenge because that's more of a deterrent to economic growth the way the government sees it. Um, Again, there's if you look at these frameworks under India stack, there is a focus on interoperability and portability and data sharing, which and the availability of data for better decision making is what is driving that movement. Again, on outside the generation side, you have control. So the idea is to digitize everything, to KYC everything, to create a unified identity across platforms, to increase more regulations to control how different ecosystems operate, whether it's healthcare, whether it's commerce, whether it is payments, whether it's speech, and more control and more government oversight on how things work. Similarly, because digital is strategic and there is a clear fear of colonization and a push for self-reliance, and we've heard these phrases consistently over a period of time, and it is a part of the philosophy of the Indian government. You're seeing, protectionism sort of seep into policy making, um, and there is a move to reverse platformization. So, if you look at what ONDC is trying to do, there is a duopoly of Amazon and Flipkart and a few others like oligopoly with uh, uh, Nykaa and Droom and uh, Snapdeal and all of these other players, Paytm Mall, which are not really that significant in the space, but they're still there. There is a move to shift to prevent this dominance of Walmart through Flipkart and Amazon. Um, so by uh, uh, by enabling interoperability of seller data, and letting anyone build an app, which is a kind of like the UPI approach. So ONDC is a private non-profit that has been set up, which is largely owned by banks, um, supported and architected by iSpirit, like UPI. So in the UPI, NPCI is owned by banks. It is a private non-profit company. And so while that is generating uh, payments data, ONDC is generating commerce and financial transactions related data. And you're trying to reverse platformization, just like you were trying to reverse the control on digital payments by Visa and MasterCard, right? So this is a decolonization or a deplatformization approach that the government is enabling these private companies to do, and supporting these private companies in terms of what they're doing. And as we've seen at the G20 statements and the approach that the government's taking, they're also pushing these as digital public goods. Although I don't know how these are public goods, but they're pushing them as digital public goods for global acceptance. And I'll get a little bit to that later. Um, so if you look at the broad direction that we're seeing in tech policy in India, number one, there's rapid digitization and business opportunities in order to get greater global investment or further digitization. Um, so the broad policy planks for India are that there is data for public good governance, interoperability of data, creating, well, uh, terrorism isn't really related to this, but that's more on the security side. But norms-based usage of tech like AI without regulation hampering the growth of AI. So even in G20 statements, we've seen that they've affirmed the role of data for development. Amitabh Kant, who's the Sherpa from India, has talked about data and digitalization for development, empowerment, financial inclusion, capacity building, and sustainable job creation. You had the Union Health Minister advocate for an inclusive and agile, responsive framework for health emergency management and largely post-COVID. Uh, and so looking at global mechanisms here uh, uh, for for addressing medical needs, and therefore the health stack is something that's going to be pitched there. Um, Again, there is this is more G20 related, but setting up centers of excellence for building the future of AI. The government would also start collecting a uniform and harmonized anonymized data sets and the usage of anonymized data sets under the National Data Governance Policy Framework, which we haven't seen much of yet. And even with non-personal data and how we're dealing with anonymized data sets, we haven't seen much there. But there is a strong focus on digital public goods and infrastructure. The other is more on the negative side, which is prevention of digital colonization and enhancement of local business capacity by exercising control over investment, the business environment in general, data and business models, and the development of these so-called digital public goods. So where this fits in is that because you're trying to control entire ecosystems, like in healthcare, in education, in payments. Let's take UPI as an example, right? So in UPI, there's zero MDR. Effectively, the government is dictating business models of UPI companies, which is why none of them are viable. Now, because they're not viable, the only ones who are able to sustain in that space or continue in that space are those who can continue to lose money with very little of a business model around. And so you have largely the dominance of PhonePe and Google Pay in that space, GPay in that space, with Paytm also participating. So in that situation, you start imposing market share limits of about 30%. right? So you're effectively restricting and exercising control over markets in that case. Now, who's to say that a similar story won't play out um, in uh, in case of ONDC or in case of the health stack over a period of time, as digital players become more dominant, and typically historically the internet is a winner takes all market, you're going to see the government use these um, platforms that they're creating or these pipelines that they're creating to exert control over policy making. The third, of course, is about centralization using digitization, also a linked point. Um, so if you look at the digital public goods architecture, like I said, exercising control over various sectors. But what's also happening, if you look at GST as well, what used to be state subjects are largely being brought under central government control. So there is centralization taking place throughout the economy, and that's how a traditional protectionist sort of an economy functions. So the broad direction that we're seeing is that it's going in that there is a sense of control and protectionism coming over entire domains. And while it's not very, this is not moving fast, uh, the direction, if you look at it across policy, seems to be clear. Excuse me. The other is that because we already have centralized platforms for speech, uh, like a Facebook, like a Twitter, like Snap, like Koo, uh, you're exercising control over speech through these platforms. And so that same centralized approach, um, which we're seeing in case of the setting up these platforms like ONDC, etc., we're seeing existing platforms, be impacted by more and more speech regulations, takedown notices, censorship, as well, similar to what you've seen with telecom operators and internet shutdowns. There is also a move to establish sovereignty over data of Indian citizens and, like I said earlier, enhanced generation and capture of data. Why this is happening is to enable the usage of data for insurance cover. India is an underinsured country, and credit opportunities. There's lack of availability of credit. So just like with UPI, the government bore the cost of KYC. Not with UPI. In case of Aadhaar, the premise behind Aadhaar when it launched was that the government takes the cost of KYC over, so that it becomes easier to identify people, and the cost of identification, the cost of doing KYC for registering of services, and therefore establishing a trail of money becomes easier. You're also seeing similar sort of mechanisms where the government is helping create non-profit entities or enabling non-profit entities to support, so that there is greater digitization and control. Uh, so the other part is, of course, so the push for sovereignty over data is in order to address cybersecurity concerns related to jurisdiction and attribution. I mean, we've heard for many years that cybersecurity related concerns that were raised with, or let's say, the MLATS process, where there were requests for data that were sent, were largely rejected because of poor drafting, and it had to go through a court. So the process was long. So the move to data localized, the move to establish control over data overseas is all linked to uh, addressing concerns of security agencies. And there you're also seeing systems like NatGrid that are supposed to have come up by now. We don't have any updated information on that yet, but even earlier last year, I think the Home Minister spoke about a national intelligence sort of database being created for security purposes. So you will see, even in the data protection bill, that there is complete exemption for government agencies that seems to be coming into play. And effectively every private company that's collecting data on citizens is collecting data for the government of India because it can be called in anytime. So, all roads are leading towards more data collection, more mapping, um, more surveillance, more control. That's the broad direction that we're seeing. The other, of course, is more on the global acceptance front to also enhance a sense of pride in India's systems with DigiYatra, with ONDC, with UPI. UPI is a major promotional plank even during G20 from what we're seeing. So what do we expect in 2023? Um, Number one, continued digitization. So last couple of years, we've seen the rollout of many facial recognition systems. You'll find that's one of the areas where we've written the most number of stories. You'll see, I think, more and more rollout of drones for agricultural purposes, for land mapping at a state level, and a push at a central level for deploying drones as well. Of course, for security purposes, during protests, etc., we saw the use of drones and facial recognition at the back end. So a combination of drones, CCTVs, and facial recognition, we're going to see more of. Uh, I'm I'm expecting that there will be a move to lower the cost of handsets in some shape and or form. It might come in through, prior to the elections, or it might happen as an election promise. But somewhere, in order to increase digitization, India has to lower the cost of handsets and enable more and more content and services in Indian languages. So somewhere over the next couple of years, you're going to see directions, you're going to see movement in that direction. There is also a move towards biometric authentication for elections. It happened in Bihar, I think, last year in the state elections. So I'm not sure if it will be rolled out this time, but we could see that. Again, UPI, I believe the last year Nepal looked at launching UPI. There have been some MOUs that have been signed in Singapore and France for the rollout of UPI, or integration with UPI. I think we'll see a more stronger consumer rollout for ONDC, more integrations for Sehmati and account aggregators as they build out that part of India stack. Health stack rollout has been slow. Frameworks are still being created. Traditional industry, which is very fragmented, is still pushing back against the health stack. But we might see we'll see continued movement there. I don't think we'll see fast movement, and we might see the beginnings of EduStack taking place, which is more education. On the G20, we're seeing a continued push for digital public goods. We're seeing global recognition of using the G20 as a platform for global recognition of India stack with digital identity, UPI, and again, digital public goods. One of the concerns that the Prime Minister raised a couple of years ago, I think, or was it last year in Sydney, was also about India wanting to spearhead the creation of a global cryptocurrency framework, especially with regards to terrorism and funding of terrorism through tech. And I think the regulation of cryptocurrencies is upon us, but India doesn't see itself making unilateral moves here because it's complicated. It might also be positioning, India versus China, maybe not during the G20, but otherwise, we're going to see more of that. Also, especially as we begin to near elections. Sorry, it's a repeated point about the global rollout of UPI, but we might also see, for example, from a global perspective, a pushback against Chinese handset companies and more promotion of India's data and credit systems, like the plans to roll out a public credit registry, the two credit frameworks for businesses and individuals in Okan and Kashi. From an elections perspective, I think e-commerce is a major one for the trader ecosystem. So we might see formal e-commerce regulations from a consumer protection perspective, which has been hanging in the balance for a while, also take shape. This is it's an important election point. We'll see, and this is something which we expected, and we saw it now in the surprise draft amendment to the, amendment to the draft IT rules, where it looks like PIB will get the ability, the Press Information Bureau of the government will get the ability to censor content on social media platforms. I think the government's also open to self-regulation, but they still want the ability to censor content, which we've seen in streaming services as well. We've already seen a move to regulate online gaming. That's a big mess. We've check out our discussion on the videos on YouTube, but our discussion on the gaming regulations. We'll also see e-commerce and marketplace related regulations if we don't see the Digital India Act. But again, for the trader lobby, all of that is going to be linked. So we'll also perhaps, some of these are repeat points, but speech regulations are going to increase. As we get closer to elections, we expect to see more flare-ups in society. We see more internet shutdowns coming up. There is also, from the minister, we've been hearing, and I think this is going to continue in order to justify the clampdown on speech, more push for trust and accountability from platforms. PIB has, if you look at the last month and a half, most of their fact check is related to content that is critical of the BJP or critical of the government from a political standpoint and the Prime Minister. So we might see more of that happening. There are a few MPs whose tweets have also been censored in the more related to the documentary about the Prime Minister. There is, I think the focus is going to be on YouTube and Twitter in particular. In the last year, YouTube has also been flagged by non-profit organizations for misinformation on the platform. And so I'm not surprised to see this recent amendment and the pushback against YouTube in particular. We've seen the government historically use these instances to do narrative building related to speech regulation and censor. So we'll see greater usage of emergency powers as well. We might end up seeing more pushback against VPNs as well, closer to the election from a security standpoint. There's the last part is that this is the term ending for the government. So there is unfinished business that they had begun in the middle of the term. And so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. My assumption is always that, by September, work will stop. But if you go back to the 2019 elections, there was a lot of hectic activity leading up to the elections on the policy front. So I would say that we might see a new version of the Telecom Bill, and perhaps the winter session, if it actually happens, we might see the bill there. Not sure what's going to happen about the data protection bill, but if it does come, that is unfinished business. You might actually see that. More amendments to the competition law, especially taking into account app stores, supporting what the CCI has ruled against Google. You might see, regulations, and PhonePe did this recently, right? Where they, one compelling thing that I hear in the startup ecosystem is that they need to create a better environment for IPOs in India. And one of the things is that when sales have happened, for example, when Flipkart was bought by Walmart, most of these transactions happened overseas in Singapore-based entities, and historically Singapore and Mauritius is where the deals have been done. So moving it back to India involves taxation, right? So if PhonePe recently shifted its headquarters to India, and Walmart agreed to pay $1 billion in taxes to the Indian government in order to facilitate that transition. So you might actually see more movement there in terms of a regulation that enables and reduces the cost for companies to transition their headquarters back to India and do an IPO. There's probably going to be a spate of new IPOs closer to the elections or post-elections. So this is going to be in preparation of that. But a new cycle has begun. Their old companies that have been around for a while need to give their investors an exit. And the recent spate of IPOs with Paytm, Zomato, Policy Bazaar was all down to a negative movement. When India had banned funding from Chinese companies, all of these companies had Chinese investors, and they had to give investors an exit and raise money from the public markets, which is why you saw these IPOs come in immediately post-COVID. I'm also expecting regulations forcing big tech companies to pay news platforms. It's the price that it's what news platforms have been pushing for a while. In an election year, governments tend to keep news companies happy. So the carrot and the stick, and this looks like it might be the carrot for them. So there is, of course, a pushback against big tech taking place. The RBI in its 2025 vision document, which we've covered on MediaNama, you should take a look at that, specifically mentions that they want to address the dominance of big tech in the financial space. You'll see continued Aadhaar voter ID linking, so that it becomes a fait accompli, like it happened with Aadhaar, for example, while the court case was on. E-pharmacy regulations are also pending. You might see something there. I don't expect a cryptocurrency regulation yet, but there might be, if at all, discussions on cryptocurrencies through a consultation paper. We might see more activity towards the latter half of the year rather than the first half of the year. And of course, both in terms of health tech and edutech, you will see a move towards figuring out self-regulation or government regulation, because this is all a very critical part of the India Stack ecosystem. I think the Digital India Bill is a medium probability rather than a major one, simply because there is too much work left to be done there. There will be an attempt to push it here, which is why it's not a low probability. I think what we might see more likely is, some aspects of it coming out in the form of regulations. In terms of e-commerce policies, consumer protection regulations, etc. So, which will then eventually be justified by the Digital India Bill. There will be rules, I think, for minors on the internet, perhaps, given that challenges related to minors using the internet seem to be a major talking point when it comes to online regulations. We'll also see, I think, regulation of the handset market, especially when it comes to Chinese handsets, with perhaps data-related requirements coming up. I think in the budget this year, we'll see a further clarification, taxation of cryptocurrencies, obviously a push for CBDC as an alternative to independent cryptocurrencies. Excuse me. From a lending apps perspective, I think the problem hasn't been solved yet. And so you might see the RBI come out with more regulations. From an electoral perspective, also, you might see a further ban on Chinese apps. And I think cloud companies haven't really been regulated at all, a little bit. No, I mean, even policies tend to give them a bit of a go. But there is more likely to be regulations around data centers and cloud companies as some of the oligopolies that dominate the Indian business space move into the data center business. The Adani Group has already set up its own data center business, and they're also, my guess is that in the next year they might launch a B2B and IoT they might launch an ISP specifically for B2B and IoT purposes. Low probability, we probably see an e-census in the next term, not in this one. We might see a cryptocurrency law again in the next term. There was a medical devices bill under consultation, but I don't know if we'll see that will see the light of the day yet. Facial recognition is probably going to be allowed to fester for a while until there is a court case or some sort of court pushback, which the government needs to legitimize. You know, the Puttaswamy judgment suggests, or I think enforces, that there needs to be a regulation if there is a fresh violation of rights, for a fresh mechanism for it, like in case of facial recognition. Might, again, because there's a court case on, you might see some sort of guidelines on search and seizure of devices, though the government will try and avoid that. I think that there's a possibility that you might see small retailers being exempt from GST in some shape or form in an election year. You'll see IoT regulations probably, but unlikely, to be honest. We had a guideline on anonymization of data come up. We might see that resurface. And I don't expect much activity on non-personal data. So, you know, I'd given my contact details previously, but thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. I'll just stop the slide sharing. Happy to take questions. Does anyone have any questions?